Hi everyone, this is Red Lines and I'm Anya Parampil. My guest today is Bogota-based human rights lawyer Santiago Salinas Miranda. Welcome to Red Lines, Santiago.
Hi, Anya. It's a pleasure to be here.
I wondered if you could start by describing recent events in Colombia, where there has been a surge in assassinations of social leaders. Who is carrying out these killings, and what is behind this uptick in violence?
Well, to understand these recent killings, it's important to see the background of the actual government. Indeed, the actual government won the election after a long campaign against the peace process, and it's a very important fact to consider the actual scenario. Uh, this campaign against peace process was against the people who was handle of the weapons. It was a campaign against FARC in any way. There was a campaign of extermination, if you want to call that, or it might be called, to be more accurate, it was a genocide campaign against the opposition that at that time was represented by FARC. Not the FARC that were the guerrilla, but the FARC that hand out the weapons. All this time after the actual government, the Ivan Duque's government has been reluctant to implement the peace agreement and bring guarantees for those who lay the weapons. But that's not the only fact. There was also an assumption of some fascist positions in the society. That's a remarkable character of the actual government. We could say that we're facing a rise of the fascism in Colombia. There's not the possibility of not to be agree with the official position without receive a threat after expressing in public your opinion. Also, there are several scandals that links the president and the vice president with the mafia, with the drug dealers. Even in the case of the vice president, Marta Lucia Ramirez, there was a clear accusation against her, but because of the link with a well-known drug dealer known as Memo Ghost of Memo Fantasma. It was a former paramilitary that used to hand the cash of these mafias, and now he was accused to make a financial support, an important financial support to the presidential campaign, to the recent presidential campaign. Also, in this scenario and with this background, to understand the death of the social leaders is not any kind of social leader who has been murdered in Colombia, the opposition social leaders. We must say that at this moment it's mainly in the rural areas of Colombia, but this is a progressive movement toward the cities. Uh, at, right now, there were more than 1,000 social leaders that has been murdered in these 2 years of government, and without make account of those uh, former ex-guerrillas that has hand off the weapons and has been murdered. It's supposed that in the peace agreement was the intention to protect these people through the use of the armed forces and the police forces, and even so, the assassination doesn't stop. And in several cases that now are in prosecution, has been proved the responsibility of the state, of the active armed forces members in the murder of these people who has handed out the weapons. So it's very problematic situation. We can say that also it's behind all of this a recomposition of drug cartels and their armies. Of course, all this recomposition wouldn't be possible without the acquiescence of government and the military forces, especially in the regions we were witnesses of how uh, the behind any operation of the army forces of the army, it came behind them the paramilitary groups. So it's a strategy to occupy those areas that used to belong to the former guerrilla, but it's not an occupation of the institutionality. It's an occupation of the organized crime that is trying to capture the financial sources on these territories. And all this is being held with the help of the armed forces. It's at this point there's no doubt about it, of the complicity between the state and these paramilitary groups that are behind, that are chasing these financial resources that is left behind by the former guerrilla groups.
I saw a recent report which places blame for the vast majority of killings on the right-wing paramilitaries which are active in Colombia, but you're saying there's really no difference between those groups and the government or the official armed forces themselves.
Yeah, indeed, it's hard uh, because sometimes they came together, sometimes they wear the same uniform, sometimes they came with the same vehicles, and it's no longer possible to make a distinction when you are in front of the military forces and when you are in front of these paramilitary groups. They have the official controls of many of the region. They are the main authority over the civil authorities, and all this has been happening just under the noses of the government. The massacres also, it's something that it's been worrying us a lot. It's like if there were an an increase of the frequency of the massacres as a strategy of social control through the terror. They make the massacres public and nothing happened. Nothing seems to happen. And nothing happened behind. It's like a public exhibition of atrocity. And it seems just to confirm the authority of these groups. So
Yeah, I'm wondering if you can break down some of the recent massacres, what exactly took place, and if there have been any arrests or attempts to hold individuals accountable for these killings.
yeah, indeed, from the recent massacres, it's important to know that the ratio of these massacres it's been like one per week since the government of Ivan Duque has started. We've been assistant of one weekly massacre since this government started. That's a very important. It's a very important fact, but. From the responsibility of the authors of the massacres, it's been resolved in two of them, but the answer it doesn't seem very. mm, It didn't appear any trust to the human rights defenders or the investigators, because it happens on in the recent year. The main prosecutor of the country, uh, the organism that is the Fiscalía General de la Nación, the organism who led in the investigation, the criminal investigations, it's under the control of the government, of the actual government. It has changed the main prosecutor, so the independence of this organ is being systematically questioned through the results that is being presented. There was a modality of fake result that they've been presenting, and this institution is being used against social leaders and leaders of opposition. So there is not much trust in the outcomes of the investigation that has been presented. Also, because in any case where the responsibility of an agent of the state is questioned, the results are slowed. We can call it like fluffy. No, it's only if it's someone that work in the base, someone that work in the field. I don't know, anything lower of lieutenant might be processed, but our lieutenant it's out of any responsibility in the system of investigation. So there's several questions about the outcomes that the prosecutor is being presented. But of course, there are two investigations that present not very reasonable outcomes against the perpetrators of two recent massacres, 2 of 53, barely.
I want to get your response to comments recently made by U.S. Senator Tim Kaine, Hillary Clinton's running mate in 2016. Listen to what he said during a recent hearing on Capitol Hill regarding Venezuela. This was featuring Trump official Elliot Abrams.
Colombia, right on the border of Venezuela, offers the antidote. If Venezuela stands as the example of you want to live under authoritarians, this is what your life's going to be like. Colombia can offer the opposite. If you embrace democratic norms and work over time, look at the positive arc you can be on.
What do you think of Senator Kaine's remarks?
Well, I'm not sure what kind of democracy the Senator Kaine refers about, because in the basic aspects of a democracy, Colombia fails in the political system. The assassination of opposition leaders, the threats to the opposition and public opinion leaders, also the lack of separation of powers, and the ingerency of the government in the justice. So it's hard to call Colombia a democracy where the basic rights are not respected. It's hard to call a democracy without freedom of speech. It's hard without freedom of media. So it's difficult. Sometimes I feel that the only reason because from the outside Colombia is called a democracy is because of the intention of the demonization of Venezuela to make a legitimate objective of war. That Colombia indeed broke all promises of a democracy, and this happened even to the Venezuelan people. Those migrants that came to Colombia are systematically victims of human trafficking, sexual exploitation, and xenophobic practices. Even they are attacked. They are frequent victims of police brutality, the lack of their rights in Colombia. It's apparent to all of us. Indeed, the precarious situation of the migration that implies that the migration of Venezuelan people makes them put them in systematic danger. So it's I don't know what's the intention of the promises, but I know for sure that call Colombia a democracy right now it's a mistake.
How does the drug war specifically impact violence in Colombia?
Well, that's quite an interesting question, especially because if you consider that the prohibition forbid the drugs and the lack of possibilities of different regulation beside forbid, it's one of the main causes of keep the conflict in the illegal rents or financial sources. So the policy of of drugs or against drugs in Colombia, it has a long story from the 90s. With the Plan Colombia, that it's where we can see clearly what the strategy of the U.S. on Colombia about this war against drugs. A war that it's obviously lost. After more than 13 years, we have no better results. The war has increased. The coca leaf crops has increased, the marijuana crops has increased, and it has no sense. It has any sense that it might be illegal if you harvest the same plant in California, but if you are I don't know, a peasant in Colombia that it has a crop of marijuana, you might be extradited to the U.S. That it has any sense. It's an irrational policy, and it has appeared like a fuel to the war. The prohibition, the forbid of any kind of drug, and the risk associated with these drugs It's the fundamental element of the high prices inside the country and in the market of drugs. Without prohibition, with, with more regulation, it might be a solution to the world. We used to say that we receive the bullets and you get the drugs. It's a symbiotic relation of the narco traffic in the north and in the south, and it's related also with the flows of capital. The money goes out and the bullets goes in. Part of the market of illegal weapons are associated to the drug market also, and those illegal weapons goes to feed the war in Colombia and increases the violence and increases the capability of these armed groups and increases their operability. So, without the possibility of regulation, we are subordinate to the decision of the U.S. about what to do with this in this drug war, and we felt sometimes that we are just pawns on this in this geostrategic control strategy.
The Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, or FARC, entered a peace agreement with the Colombian government in 2016, agreeing to lay down their weapons. You touched on this earlier, but can you get into the specific details of how the government failed to keep its end of the bargain and what the effect of that peace has been?
Well, we could now talk of a broken peace. There were, after the several attacks of this government against the peace agreement, it happens what historically has happened in Colombia with the peace agreement. Some of the parts, especially the guerrillas or those who has the minority of a political representation, they return to the war. And when they return to the war, they make a new input of violence through the whole society. And there's an opportunity of a public speech of an inner enemy, of a dissident enemy that must be pursued through the whole society. Behind the excuse of pursue the guerrilla, it has been murdered syndicalists, social leaders, environmental activists, public leader, opinion public leaders. So after the war, there's nothing different than the prosecution of the opposition, of any opposition. When they defraud the peace, when the government defound the peace, because that's a part also, they have put a lot of pressure over these people who has held the weapons, and they are waiting what to do if the peace is going to be implemented, if the investment is going to be effective in these territories that they have agreement on the peace agreement, that they will be receive some resources to overcome all the necessities after the war, and the security also of these people has been defound and the systematic murder without any response of the government or any useful response of the government. It has been a lot of pressure to those people who's been tired of the war and has been pushed to it by the arrogancy and of the government. There's no way that this situation is being sustainable if it's not by the will and commitment of the ex-FARC with the peace. It's it's a sad story because it's more of a political will. The implementation of peace depends of the decision of government to make a commitment with the peace, and this lack of commitment, it's counted in lives. When the government decide no longer to support the transport, no longer to support the security of these people, no longer to support their commitment with the investment, or to restrain the investment in the areas of the former FARC groups, it's only a way to push them to the war again. Because the speech of the war, it's a very useful speech to suppress any kind of political dissidents. This has been a historical way to pursue and prosecute the political opposition in Colombia. And this time it was no useful to have a guerrilla that doesn't want to fight against the state. It must be an enemy that justify this pursuit. It must be an enemy to justify the abuse and the harass against the political opposition. And so it's been the reason we feel that that's the reason, the main reason, to push, to put all this pressure in against the peace agreement.
U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo visited the region this week, stopping in Bogota. He essentially paid a visit to all of the countries which surround Venezuela, signaling to some that Washington is planning some sort of October surprise. The Colombian Air Force and U.S. Southern Command also held joint military drills in the Caribbean between September 18th and 21st. How does U.S. policy in Venezuela influence militarization in Colombia?
Well, Jamie, it's been a increasingly militarization of Colombian society. That's a fact. And this it's been traduced on actions of war, especially in the borders of Venezuela, like Cucuta, by example, and the violence against different groups in this region. The militarization of life, it's not only the way of the presence of armed forces on the street, that now is very usual. It's also the diversification of the task that they had now on. They are in a joint operation with the police, the joint operation with the prosecutor. It would be like the marshals in the U.S. It's joint operation with the army, and this militarization it's translate in a treatment of war to any that doesn't be agree with the political government, in actions of war against the social protest. It's a recent phenomena, but it has their roots in the historical cooperation that Colombia has sustained with the U.S. There's we must say that the bulk of problems it's not on the militarization itself between the armed forces. It has a lot of sense that the armed forces change their task and try to project their areas of work to different areas. The problem is in the civil relation that it's been deteriorated by this militarization. The lack of control over the military forces by the civil powers, it's apparent right now. Even if you know, in recent protests at the city of Bogota, 17 people has been murdered during the riot by the police. 17 people in 3 days. It's a lot. It's a massacre, and all this happened in the capital of the country, over behind the nose of all the authorities, of the civil authorities, and no one seems capable to stop them. There's a declaration of independence of the armed force from the civil powers. And it might be related with this pressure to a militarization, this idea of a military state, the state that is becoming ready, that is preparing to the war. Also, the speech of the war, it's a catastrophe for an economy like the Colombian economy, that it's 73% informal. So, and of course, these areas that are situated in the border of Venezuela are poor areas. There are a lot of poor villages that pollute in these areas, and they live from the exchange of the products of Venezuela. So this idea of militarization, this idea of an enemy that it's also acting inner and out of the country, it has a lot of implication. Also because it's been presented to the society from years behind that the guerrillas of Colombia are allied with the Venezuelan regime. So, with Venezuela state, indeed, that they are allied. So they are bringing a threat of war to those communities, and they are becoming, even the police are becoming occupying armies of these territories in the border, and also of any of the places where they might suspect that there's the ELN guerrilla or the ex-FARC guerrilla. It's been systematically pressured the population of these areas, like if they were an outsider, like if they were from another state, and their guarantees and the state of law is no longer applicable to these communities.
Finally, Santiago, what do you make of the international community's silence on this wave of violence sweeping Colombia? Why isn't there more outrage?
I can suppose that this silence is related with the idea of a larger objective, like a strategic position facing the menace of Venezuela. I guess that the reason because there's this silence on the international community is because it's some kind of certainty that Colombia, it would be the platform to attack Venezuela, and no one wants to be in a bad relation with the platform against this how we can call it, against this narrative of an evil country. So I guess the idea of demonization of Venezuela pass also it's founded by the idea, or set their foundation in the idea of not to talk about human rights violations in any other country. So if we have to, like the international community, if we must make Venezuela the pure evil, we can't talk about the same practice or similar practice of that occurs in some other countries, and even worse practice that occur in some other countries. It's like the the kind of exchange it would be the Colombians' human rights. We deny the human rights violation in Colombia to make it possible to support the idea of the biggest evil in their neighbor, like Venezuela.
Santiago Salinas Miranda, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it, and good luck with the work that you do in Colombia.
Thanks.